Dieter Dengler was born in Wildberg in the Black Forest region of Germany. He was accepted as a pilot into the Navy, and then the Vietnam War broke out, and he was shipped all the way over to the battle zone in an aircraft carrier ready to embark on missions in his fighter plane. On that fateful morning, he and 2 other pilots left the aircraft carrier. Little did Dieter know the next 6 months would be a journey into hell. Their mission was to destroy an enemy target deep into enemy territory, but the weather started closing in and Dieter lost sight and lost contact of the other 2 pilots on the mission. He was completely on his own, but he was getting closer to the target. As he got closer to the target, he knew that he had to invert the plane and fly upside down in order to see the target and unleash his machine guns upon it. As he inverted, he was hit by anti-aircraft fire. A huge flash and bang erupted, described by Dieter as like a lightning flash, and it took most of the right wing of the plane with it. He reacted quickly and dumped his fuel tanks, and then the plane started tumbling through the sky towards the ground. It crashed into an open clearing. The left wing tore off, the right wing completely tore off, and the whole fuselage began tumbling and cartwheeling with Dieter inside it, and then he blacked out. When he came round, it was all quiet, save for the fizzing sound of a small fire in the cockpit. He knew he needed to get out quickly, so he unfastened himself from the seat and got out of the plane and crawled into the jungle. He knew that he had to stay in cover, deep in cover of the jungle, in order to survive. So he spent the next 2 days deep inside the jungle, evading enemy capture. However, he had to emerge to try and get food and drink, and he came to a clearing, and despite checking both ways, he stepped into the clearing and heard 2 men shouting. One had a rifle and one had a pistol, and they quickly stripped him of all his possessions. They let him, however, keep his wedding ring, and they began marching him through the jungle. Their target destination was Vietnam itself, because he'd crash landed in Laos, which was to the west of Vietnam. So they marched day and night eastwards towards Vietnam because they wanted to hand him over to the dreaded Viet Cong soldiers. Every night they would rope him and peg him to the ground. Both arms were pegged and roped and tied up above his head on the ground as he lay down, and both of his legs were roped up and tied down and pegged and staked into the ground. Most mornings he would wake up and he wouldn't be able to open his eyes because he'd been stung so much by mosquitoes that his whole face was swollen. They kept marching day and night, and Dieter didn't know when it was going to end. He knew he had to forge some kind of escape plan. So during one of the night marches, despite having his hands tied up, he managed to get a mirror from the back pocket of one of the guards, and he knew he was going to use this to signal for a plane. He just had to wait for the right opportunity. After days and days of marching, they finally took rest in a hut, and he'd spent several days tied down in this hut. And every night he had a guard on one side of him and a guard on the other side of him, and he was completely pegged down by the arms and the feet. Every night he spent at that hut, he heard planes circling up above. He knew if he could just get a signal to them, he could get rescued. So one night, the opportunity came. He pretended to fall asleep and waited for the sound of the snoring from the guards. He wrenched out the stakes that were on his hands. Then he wrenched out the stakes that were tying his feet to the ground, and he began making his escape from the hut. But all the commotion led to the pigs and chickens outside of the hut kicking off with a massive noise and hullabaloo. He thought, oh no, I'm going to get caught here. He was terrified that the guards would wake up, so he rushed back to his spot, lay down in position. But the guards didn't wake up. He then went through the maneuver one more time just to check that they were fast asleep. And sure enough, they kept snoring. So he broke free and left the hut. He had his mirror and he knew he had to get to high ground in order to signal a plane. The full moon was out in the dark night sky and he saw a mountain close by and he began climbing. However, he was barefoot and the mountain was made of rocky, jaggy rock that would cut his feet to pieces with every step. He painstakingly made his way up towards the top of the mountain. And once he reached the summit, he had the mirror ready and waiting for when a plane would pass by and he could reflect the moonlight onto the mirror and up to the plane to get rescued. But the plane never came. It was the only night there had been no search parties and no planes circling the camp. He fell asleep exhausted and depressed. The next morning, he was woken by the searing heat of the sun. He knew he had to make his way down the mountain to get water quickly, otherwise he was going to die. So he carefully navigated down the rocky cliff face all the way down into the jungle, and he found the only water source he could, a putrid pool of sitting, resting water. But even worse than that is the fact that his captors were waiting for him at that very spot. They knew he'd have to come down from the mountain, and they knew he'd need that water source. They seized hold of him, and the torture began. By this point, the guards were fuming with Dieter at his escape attempt, so they wreaked out endless punishments on him, including hanging him upside down and putting an ant's nest on his face until he passed out. Many nights, they would suspend him upside down with a rope in a deep water well so he would almost drown at night if he fell asleep. But Dieter was worth way more to them alive than he was dead. On one particular day, they gathered in a circle of guards around Dieter. The main guard slowly approached him and with the butt of his rifle smashed Dieter in the shoulder. The rifle accidentally fired behind the guard and shot and killed one of the other guards. A fight ensued as another guard started firing on the guard who'd hit Dieter, and a whole firefight erupted around Dieter as he lay cowering on the ground with his head in his hands. He was sure he was going to die, but somehow he survived. They dragged him off to the local village for more humiliation. They rope-tied him to a water buffalo by his ankles and whipped the water buffalo so it dragged him through the village as children and villagers were laughing. And some of the guards would run after him and kick dirt in his face and jump on his back and ride him as the water buffalo pulled Dieter around the village. They tried to get him to sign a document saying that he agreed the Americans should end their aggression against Vietnam, but he refused, and he remembered his grandfather in Germany, who was the only person in his town who refused to support Adolf Hitler. His grandfather was humiliated, taunted, and abused because of the stand that he took, but he stood firm, and that's what Dieter did as well. So the guards cut him in numerous places. They cut his hands, deep cuts on his hands, on his arms, on his upper arms, and on his chest, and they would place bamboo into these cuts to maximize the pain that he felt. They even tied rope tightly around his left arm until it killed the nerves and he lost use of his hand. And the whole time they kept marching day and night eastwards towards Vietnam and those Viet Cong soldiers. And he was finally handed over, and he knew instantly these were a different breed, more ruthless, more terrifying, and more deadly. They were much more thorough when they tied him up at night, and there was no way he would be able to escape from these guys. One day during a march, they settled in a village, and the villager came to him with a bowl of rice, and he seemed friendly, and Dieter took the bowl of rice and said thank you. And then the villager pointed at Dieter's wedding ring as if he wanted to take it, as if he wanted to have it for his own. But it was Dieter's only possession. It was his only link back to his wife, to his family, and to his previous life. And there was no way he would be letting this go. And a tussle ensued. The villager tried to pull the ring, and Dieter tried to pull it back. Then the villager walked away. He returned with a machete. Dieter knew it was serious and he had to give over the ring. So sad and tears in his eyes, he took off the ring and handed it to the villager. A few minutes later, he was marched off continuously towards the next prison camp by the Viet Cong. But he was so sad and distraught about losing his ring, he decided to tell them. He made stealing gestures and pointed back to the village. His Viet Cong captors signaled to do a U-turn and they all marched together back to the village. The main Viet Cong leader found the villager in question with the ring on his finger, and he took the villager's arm and he put it on a table. He took his own machete and chopped off the villager's finger and gave the finger to Dieter so Dieter could take the ring and put it back on his own. Dieter was terrified and shocked and so sad to his core that he had caused this terror and this suffering, and he knew at that moment that he could not mess with the Viet Cong. After 3.5 long weeks of marching day and night with the Viet Cong, they finally arrived at the prison camp, and Dieter was looking forward to it. After countless times of losing blood, losing consciousness, being beaten, being tortured, he was looking forward to having somebody he hoped to share his suffering with. He was thrown into one of the huts made with impenetrable bamboo walls, and for a few hours he was all alone and he started to lose hope. But then the other prisoners started to emerge. One of them was carrying his own intestines that the guards had cut out of his stomach. Another had no teeth because the guards had knocked them out with a rusty nail and a rock. All of the 6 prisoners, including an American called Dwayne Martin, had been there over 2 years. Dieter looked at the state of them and thought, this is what I'm going to look like in 6 months. And he announced, I'm getting out of here tonight. You can't do that, they said in unison. You need to wait for the monsoon rains. If you escape now, there'll be nothing to drink and you'll die even if you get out of the camp. It was 6 months until the monsoon rains were due to start, and here they were in the worst torture prison camp on earth. Every night they were cross-handcuffed together from one man to the next so nobody could escape, and sleep was almost impossible. They weren't given any blankets and they were just expected to sleep sitting up on hard wooden boards. Food was almost non-existent. Occasionally, the guards would hunt a deer. They'd eat all the meat and then they'd give the prisoners whatever was inside the deer's stomach. Sometimes they'd leave the uneaten meat for several days and present it to the prisoners, completely rotten, stinking to high heaven and full of maggots. But they had no choice. They had to eat it. Sometimes Dieter and his fellow prisoners would get lucky and catch either a rat or a snake underneath the boards of their hut and eat it raw. At first, they were given 2 minutes every day to go and use the toilet, but they would have to run the risk of losing their life every time because the guards would shoot on them for fun, and many prisoners would return from their toilet trip with bullet wounds to the side of their head. The prisoners quickly agreed they would stay where they were to use the toilet and had to defecate where they sat. They continued to plan their escape, and it was made even more urgent when one of them overheard 2 guards discussing their own plan. They were going to kill all the prisoners and make it look like an escape so they could get off duty and return home. They began tracking every single weapon and every guard in the camp, so they knew at any given time where each of the weapons were and where each of the guards were. There was a 3-minute window every day when the camp cook would shout, "Chow time!" and all the guards would go and collect their food and leave their weapons momentarily behind. The problem was Dieter and all of the prisoners still remained handcuffed during this time. But after much experimentation, they found a way to shimmy open the handcuffs with a small shard of metal. So finally, after 6 long months, the day had arrived. The monsoons were here, and the camp cook shouted chow time. Dieter shimmied out of his handcuffs and broke underneath his hut and crawled over to where 3 weapons were left. He got 2 of the weapons and handed them over to the other prisoners who were now free, and he took a submachine gun for himself. But then everything went crazy. The guards did have some weapons, and there was a firefight busting out all over the camp. There were 5 guards rushing towards Dieter, some of them armed with guns. He took the submachine gun and offloaded, but it had massive recoil. He couldn't control it. He'd never used it before. It fired shots all into the air, hitting nobody. He regained composure as the guards got closer and fired and fired. There was still 1 guard left, and he had a machete. He was closing in on Dieter. Dieter offloaded more bullets, and finally the man collapsed dead. He looked around and he'd killed 5 guards. He patted himself down, sure that he'd been shot, but he was unscathed. He rushed with his friend Dwayne, and they went to get shoes at the entrance for the camp. They'd need those to get into the jungle. 2 guards had escaped, and they were rushing off to get help, so they had to get out of the camp as quickly as possible. But when they got to where the shoes were stored, there were no shoes left. The other prisoners that had escaped had taken them all. So Dieter and Dwayne headed into the dark of the jungle that night, barefoot. 5 other escapees headed off, 7 in total, but as you'll discover in a moment, only Dieter would survive. They knew their only chance of survival was staying in the jungle and hoping to find a river that would take them to Thailand and freedom. So after trekking for 10 days through the jungle, their feet cut to pieces on all the thorns and rocks of the jungle floor, they found a river and they thought they were saved. It was a big river and they could build a raft and float down to Thailand and freedom. So they alighted the raft and started floating down the river. But after an hour and a half, they heard a roaring sound. Water. It was a waterfall, and they were getting closer by the second. Dwayne jumped off the raft and scrambled to the shoreline, shouting at Dieter, "Bail out! Bail out!" But Dieter did not want to leave the raft behind, and he was also holding 2 rifles. But he saw the waterfall's edge getting ever closer, so he jumped off the raft. But now he couldn't swim. He had 2 guns, and he was getting closer to the edge. At the last minute, he grabbed onto a rock, his feet almost dangling over the edge of the waterfall as the raft cascaded down and smashed into smithereens at the bottom. He clambered out of the river, and he and Dwayne sat there, their faces ghostly white, having just avoided death by the tiniest of margins. But what would they do next? The descent down the waterfall was covered in slippery green moss, and they would surely find their death if they made that route. After much searching, they found vines, and they slowly descended down the waterfall. It took them hours and hours. As the days went on, they faced ordeal after ordeal. Their feet were still being torn up. The monsoons were so insane, they would have to climb to higher ground every night and tie themselves to a tree to avoid being swept away by the mudslides. Then, in the mornings, they would wake up to black, thick belts of leeches around them that would find all the soft spots in their body, their neck, their armpits, between the fingers, and they would have to peel them off with strips of bamboo. But throughout it all, they had each other. They would hug each other at night for warmth. They shared the friendship, and they also shared a common dream of reaching Thailand. They continued to trek along, following the river as it went. And one night they built a fire, hoping to attract and signal to any passing planes. And sure enough, this time a plane did come past, and they were certain they'd be rescued the next day. They started celebrating. They started talking about who's going to get on the helicopter first, who's going to call who, what are you going to eat when you first get something to eat. The next day, the plane never came. By this time, they were so exhausted they could no longer walk. They were crawling on their hands and knees. On this particular morning, they saw a villager boy with a water vessel collecting water from the river's edge. They both crawled up and extended their hands as a peace offering and to say hello. but a huge commotion broke out. Numerous villagers emerged from the jungle down towards the river's edge. Both Dieter and Dwayne put their hands in their air to say, "Don't attack us, we come in peace." But one of the villagers took a machete high above his head and swung it violently. Dieter ducked and it missed his head, but it then hit Dwayne in the leg. Dwayne reached down to his leg, screaming in pain, and Dwayne was screaming in fright. But it was too late. The villager raised the machete again, swiped, and cut off Dwayne's head. Dieter screamed in terror and anguish like a banshee, and all the villagers backed off as he sped away into the jungle. And the following days were some of the darkest of Dieter's life. He started being followed by a bear that would circle him, getting ever closer. Dieter knew this bear was just waiting to eat him. But he found some strange comfort in that bear, which for Dieter represented death itself. He'd lost everything else, and now death was his only friend. But death didn't want him. Dieter kept fighting. One day he found a part of a white flare parachute that had been let off by one of the allies, and he took the white parachute fragment and put it in his backpack. Several days later, when he was on a bend of a river, he heard a plane coming down the valley. He didn't know if he was hallucinating or if it was real, and he took out the fragment of parachute as the plane emerged from the clouds, and he was waving it, trying to make an SOS signal with the shape that he was waving. But he didn't know, am I getting the S the right way round? He was completely panicked, and the plane flew past. Dieter didn't lose hope. He assembled an SOS symbol on the ground with his clothing, and sure enough, the plane returned, this time making a slower pass, and Dieter waved again. The pilot would later recount that it was a 1,000,000-to-1 shot that he would see Dieter that day. His sortie was supposed to leave 5 hours earlier, but he got delayed. If he had seen Dieter on a straight part of the river, he wouldn't have seen him because he can't see lower down in the cockpit. Only would he have seen him if he was on this bend. And he also had to plead and beg with his superiors to even authorize a rescue mission because there were no known survivors or downed airmen in this area. But finally, a rescue helicopter appeared and started lowering down towards Dieter. He still thought he was hallucinating. It was only when he smelt the diesel from the helicopter that he knew this was real. But then Viet Cong emerged from the jungle and began opening fire on Dieter and on the helicopter. He was so weak he couldn't hold on to the rope that they'd lowered down, so he had to wedge it underneath his armpit, and they lifted him up onto the helicopter. But it wasn't over then. They had no idea who this figure was. Maybe he was the enemy. Maybe he had a grenade. And they searched him, and they found inside his shirt what they thought was a grenade, and they nearly threw him back out of the helicopter. But it was a half-eaten snake that Dieter had caught in the river the day before. Dieter was taken to hospital, but he wouldn't settle there. He had nightmares and terrors, so his friends rescued him and took him back to the aircraft carrier. He suffered from night terrors even on that aircraft carrier, and they would have to cocoon him inside one of the aeroplane cockpits just to try and get him to go to sleep. In later life, Dieter would retire from the military and became a civilian test pilot and survived 4 more crashes. When Dieter passed away aged 62, he was given full military honors. He died a true war hero.